Imagine a world where kindness is a currency, freely given to some, but denied entirely to others. Where silence is your constant companion, and the only touch you know is the brush of cold air. This is the hidden truth of many, a silent scream lost in the noise of busy lives. The sting of being forgotten, the ache of watching others receive the warmth you crave. This is the foundation of a spirit tested, forged in the fires of neglect. But what happens when that spirit refuses to break? When the ignored finally finds their voice? This is the beginning of that journey, witnessing the struggle against the tide of indifference, seeing how resilience blossoms in the harshest soil. That's the power of story. If you believe that every voice, no matter how small, deserves to be heard, if you find strength in the fight for what's right, show your support. Like this video and subscribe to join us in uncovering more tales of courage, justice, and the enduring strength of the human spirit. Elara knew this world intimately. It was the only home she had ever known, a sprawling gray stone building known simply as the institution. But home implies warmth, belonging. This place offered neither. A perpetual chill seemed to seep from the very walls, clinging to skin and bone, regardless of the season. The air hung heavy, with the faint, cloying scent of cheap disinfectant, struggling to mask the underlying smell of tired laundry and indifferent cooking. Her days were a monotonous cycle of bland porridge, mandatory chores, and the searing sting of being unseen. It wasn't just the absence of kindness that cut deep. It was the stark presence of its opposite, lavished upon others. Matron Agnes, a woman whose smile was a rare, brittle thing reserved for the plump, rosy-cheeked children, often called out names with genuine warmth, offering extra biscuits or a favored chore. But Elara's name was never among them. She faded into the background, a shadow against the peeling paint of the corridors. Meals were a blur of clattering spoons and loud chatter that never included her. Playtime was a cruel ballet of exclusion, games forming around her as if she were merely part of the dusty floor. Smallow children, sensing the unspoken rule of her insignificance, would trip her in the yard, their laughter echoing like shards of glass. Older ones would snatch the worn book she sometimes managed to find, tearing pages just to watch her quiet despair. There were no grand villains, mostly just the slow, grinding erosion of her spirit by casual indifference and petty malice. The taste of her own tears, mixed with the gritty dust on the floor, was a flavor she knew well. Every glance that slid past her, every door that closed just as she approached, reinforced the suffocating truth. She was the orphan ignored by all, a forgotten whisper in a world that roared for others. The biting cold always found the gaps in Elara's threadbare shawl, a constant, unwelcome touch against her skin. Hunger was a dull, aching guest that resided perpetually in her belly, a stark contrast to the warm smells of baking bread and roasting meat that occasionally drifted from the main hall, smells meant for others. She watched through dusty panes as children her age, clothed in sturdy fabrics and beaming with easy confidence, laughed and chased one another, their calls echoing like bright music she couldn't join. Their hands held toys crafted with care. Her own were often chapped and raw from endless, unthanked chores. Affection was a language spoken in gentle touches, warm embraces, and whispered words of encouragement, a language she only witnessed from a distance. No soothing hand ever ruffled her hair. No proud glance ever acknowledged her quiet diligence. She existed in the periphery, a shadow, flitting through the grand, sunlit rooms where others lived fully. Opportunities, the simple chance to learn a craft, to read a book, even to sit undisturbed for a few precious moments, were lavish gifts bestowed upon those deemed worthy, a category from which she was perpetually excluded. Once, she had dared to reach for a fallen apple, a vibrant red globe that seemed to promise fleeting sweetness. Before her fingers could even brush its skin, a sharp voice cut through the air.
What do you think you're doing? That's not for you. Get back to your work.
The words, delivered with a disdainful curl of the lip, felt like a physical blow. The apple rolled away, forgotten, as Elara retreated, her face carefully blank, a mask of practiced invisibility settling over her features. Each instance of being overlooked, each casual dismissal, chipped away at her spirit, leaving a raw, painful ache deep within. Yet no tear ever fell publicly, no cry ever escaped her lips. She swallowed the pain, pushing it down into a quiet, resilient core. Her eyes, large and observant, held a depth that belied her years, reflecting the world's unfairness, but also a quiet strength that refused to break. She learned to find warmth in slivers of sunlight, nourishment in meager crusts, and solace in the silent company of the stars she sometimes glimpsed through a cracked window pane. Her existence was a constant negotiation with scarcity and neglect, a silent testament to a spirit that, though wounded, refused to surrender to the shadows completely. The injustice burned, a slow, smoldering ember inside. But for now, it remained hidden, banked by the need to simply endure another day. The clang of metal trays echoed in the vast dining hall, a sound that usually signaled a temporary reprieve from the day's anxieties, but for Elara, often felt like entering a stage where she was always out of step. She held her simple plate, its meager contents smelling faintly of boiled potatoes and something indistinguishable, and sought a quiet corner. The air hung heavy with the mixed odors of industrial cleaner and lukewarm food. She just wanted to eat, unnoticed, to disappear into the background, like dust motes dancing in the shafts of gray light from the high windows. But today, invisibility was not an option. As she shuffled towards an empty seat, her worn, hand-me-down sweater snagged on the edge of a table. A small, patched tear, already present, widened slightly. It was a tiny imperfection, easily overlooked, yet the sharp eyes of Miss Higgins, a staff member known for her biting remarks and disdainful gaze, caught it. A hush fell over the nearby tables as children instinctively sensed a shift in the room's atmosphere, a predator honing in. Miss Higgins. Higgins strode over, her uniform stiff, her expression set in disapproval. She didn't need to raise her voice much. The acoustics of the hall carried every word, amplifying the cold judgment. The sudden silence felt like a spotlight, hot and unwelcome, turning Elara's cheeks crimson. She felt exposed, her threadbare clothing a public indictment.
Oh, look what we have here. Still wearing that old thing, Elara? Honestly, couldn't you at least try to look presentable? It's falling apart.
Her words were meant to sting, and they did. The few children near Miss Higgins giggled, a cruel, sharp sound that pierced the already tense quiet. Elara instinctively pulled the sweater tighter, feeling the rough wool against her skin, a physical manifestation of her shame. Her eyes darted around, seeking a friendly face, any adult who might step in, someone to offer a word of kindness or defense. But the other staff members were suddenly engrossed in sorting cutlery or supervising elsewhere, their backs deliberately turned. The children at other tables watched, some with morbid curiosity, others with a learned indifference, nobody offering a whispered word of support. The laughter from the bullies escalated, emboldened by the clear lack of intervention. One of the older girls, known for mimicking the staff's cruelty, added her voice to the fray, her tone dripping with mock pity.
Maybe she likes looking like a scarecrow. Keeps the other kids away, doesn't it?
The table nearest them erupted in louder, more confident laughter. Elara's breath hitched in her throat. The simple act of snagging her sweater had transformed into a full-blown public spectacle of her perceived inadequacy, her poverty, her outsider status. She stood rooted to the spot, the weight of dozens of eyes pressing down on her, the sound of the mockery echoing inside her head. Her plate trembled in her hands. The smell of the unappetizing food, now thick with the bitter taste of humiliation. No one was coming to help. No one cared. The cold, hard reality settled deep in her gut. She was utterly alone in this moment, abandoned to the wolves. The feeling was a physical blow, stealing her ability to speak, to move, leaving her raw and vulnerable under the unforgiving glare of the hall's lights and the mocking eyes of its occupants. The shame burned hotter than any fire, searing itself into her memory. A heavy cloak of dread settled upon Elara's shoulders, a weight pressing her down until the only viable path seemed to be inward. The echoes of harsh words and indifferent glances clung to her like a damp shroud, making the air thick and hard to breathe. Her feet carried her instinctively away from the open spaces, the bustling hallways, the eyes that seemed to judge with every flicker. She sought the forgotten edges of the world, the places where shadows gathered and dust motes danced unseen in the stray beams of light. Her sanctuary was a small, unused storage closet tucked beneath a stairwell, smelling faintly of old wood and forgotten things. It was cramped, often chilly, but it was hers. There, curled amidst discarded mops and empty paint cans, she could finally let the rigid tension drain from her muscles. The silence here wasn't empty. It was a soft blanket that muffled the harsh sounds of the outside world, allowing her own racing heart to slow its frantic pace. This was her physical retreat, a place where the walls were solid and the world outside could not reach her. But the true retreat was deeper, a quiet shutting down of the emotional gates. She learned to build walls around her heart, to dull the sharp edges of pain, to present a blank face when faced with cruelty. Inside the dusty closet, the blankness dissolved, replaced by a quiet sorrow that flowed into the worn pages of a small, leather-bound sketchpad she kept hidden. The smell of the aged paper was comforting, and the smooth, cool surface felt grounding beneath her fingertips. Here, the conflict wasn't external shouts, but the silent war between despair and a stubborn, flickering ember of self. With a pencil, she etched the turmoil onto the page, not in words she couldn't voice, but in jagged lines and swirling shadows. The scratching sound of the lead against the paper was a quiet, rhythmic counterpoint to the chaos in her mind. As the shapes formed, the pressure seemed to ease, the tangled emotions finding an outlet. It was a lonely, isolated act. Yet in this solitude, a strange kind of strength began to coalesce. She poured the pain, the injustice, the crushing weight of her isolation into these drawings, the images, a silent scream against the unfairness of it all. The retreat escalated from moments of seeking solace to prolonged periods, the outside world receding further with each line she drew. This hidden activity wasn't just an escape. It was a secret act of processing, of refusing to let the suffering consume her entirely. Sometimes a quiet whisper escaped her lips in the stillness of her refuge.
They don't see. They don't understand.
It was a soft, fragile sound, swallowed by the silence. But with each line drawn, each emotion translated onto the page, the fragile whisper gained a touch of resilience. This was her quiet defiance, her refusal to be broken, transforming the retreat from mere hiding into a silent preparation. In the heart of her isolation, she was not simply waiting for the storm to pass. She was quietly gathering her strength, finding a voice that needed no sound to be powerful. The solitude was a double-edged sword, cutting her off from others, but forging an unbreakable core within. The persistent, gnawing ache of loneliness settled deep in Elara's bones, a cold constant despite the thin, threadbare sweater she wore. She watched from the periphery, the sounds of other children's hurried footsteps and bright, fleeting laughter echoing like a foreign language in the vast, cavernous hall. Her own existence felt muted, a gray shadow against the vibrant tapestry of their interactions. A fragile, almost imperceptible tendril of hope unfurled within her chest as her eyes landed on a girl sitting alone by a dusty window pane. She held a doll whose dress, though faded, was less tattered than anything Elara had ever touched. Gathering a courage she didn't know she possessed, a boldness born only of desperation, Elara moved towards the girl. The air felt thick and heavy, with the institutional smell of disinfectant and stale air. Each step she took crunching faintly on the worn linoleum floor. Her small hand clutched a chipped, dull red pebble she had found in the barren yard. A tiny offering she hoped might bridge the chasm between them. She stopped a few feet away, her heart thrumming a nervous rhythm against her ribs. The other girl looked up, her eyes, initially curious, narrowed slightly as she took in Elara's patched clothes and hesitant stance. A flicker of something cold, something dismissive, passed across her features. Elara held out the pebble, a silent, hopeful gesture. The girl's gaze dropped to the offering, then back to Elara's face, a smirk twisting her lips. The warmth that had briefly ignited in Elara's chest flickered and died under the weight of that look.
What's that supposed to be? I don't want your dirty rock. Go away.
The words hung in the air, sharp and cutting. They pierced the thin shield Elara had raised, shattering her fragile hope into a million icy shards. The simple, cruel dismissal landed like a physical blow, stealing her breath. Her hand trembled, the pebble feeling suddenly heavy and insignificant. It wasn't just the rock. It was her the girl didn't want. She felt a wave of profound shame wash over her, hotter than any flush. The room seemed to tilt slightly, the cheerful sounds of play, now sounding mocking and distant. Her throat tightened, and the taste of something metallic and bitter filled her mouth, perhaps the residue of crushed dreams. She was dirty. She was unwanted. She was unworthy. The silence that followed the girl's words was deafening, punctuated only by the cruel laughter from the other side of the room, which now seemed directed solely at her. Retreating felt like the only option, each step back dragging her deeper into the suffocating embrace of her own solitary world. The attempt had failed, leaving her more exposed and alone than she had been before. The pebble slipped from her numb fingers, hitting the floor with a soft, unnoticed tap. It lay there, a small, red testament to an unheard cry for connection. The air in the grand hall shimmered with a fragile electric hope. Brightly colored banners hung a little crookedly, a testament to hurried hands, and the polished floor gleamed, reflecting the nervous energy of the children assembled there. This was the biannual adoption day, a whirlwind of potential futures packed into a few chaotic hours. Children, scrubbed clean and dressed in their best, lined up or clustered in small groups, eyes wide and searching, holding on to fleeting smiles and rehearsed introductions. The scent of cheap air freshener mingled with the faint, warm smell of cookies from the kitchen, a promised treat for later, but mostly a lure for the arriving adults. Elara stood slightly apart, near the tall, sunlit windows, the light illuminating the worn knees of her simple blue dress. She wasn't as loud or as quick to dart forward as the younger ones, nor did she possess the practiced, charming banter of some of the older residents. Her hope was a fragile, carefully guarded thing, built upon the crumbling foundation of past disappointments. Each adoption day had been a mirror reflecting her own invisibility. She watched the large doors swing open, admitting the first wave of visitors. Couples, single adults, families, all faces she desperately hoped might finally see her. The room filled quickly with a low murmur of polite conversation, punctuated by bursts of excited childish chatter. Staff members, bright smiles plastered on their faces, guided the visitors, pointing out children, sharing anecdotes, showcasing talents.
And this is little Lily. She just loves to draw. Isn't her picture wonderful?
One exclaimed nearby, holding up a crayon scribble for a visiting woman. Another staff member beamed, introducing a boisterous group of brothers.
These boys are full of energy, perfect for an active family.
Elara straightened her shoulders, offering a small, hopeful smile towards a couple pausing near her section. Their eyes scanned the children, their expressions pleasant but distant. Elara shifted, trying to catch their gaze, to convey something, anything that might make her stand out from the bustling backdrop. But their eyes simply drifted past her, landing on a younger child performing an impromptu cartwheel. The couple chuckled, moving on. A lump formed in Elara's throat, thick and bitter. She tried again with another pair, a man and a woman in smart coats. She held her breath, willing herself to be visible. The woman glanced her way. A flicker of acknowledgement, perhaps? Elara's heart gave a tiny, desperate leap. But the woman turned back to the staff member, asking about a different child she'd noticed across the room.
Oh, you mean Thomas? He's a sweet boy, a bit shy, but so smart.
It continued like this, a relentless cycle of near misses and absolute oversight. The noise of the room, initially a sound of hope, became a deafening roar of her own isolation. Laughter sounded mocking. The bright decorations felt like a cruel joke. She retreated further into the shadow of the window frame, the polished floor reflecting not her hopeful face, but the backs of strangers walking away. The cookies suddenly felt like ash in her imagined taste. Raw pain bloomed in her chest, a crushing weight pressing down on her lungs, making it hard to breathe. She wasn't just being ignored, she was utterly invisible, a ghost in a room full of vibrant, desirable lives. Hopelessness, cold and vast, settled over her like a shroud. The thin blanket offered little defense against the pre-dawn chill that crept through the drafty window pane, a stark reminder that even the simplest comfort was now a luxury often denied. The biting cold seemed a physical manifestation of the escalating cruelty that had begun to define her days. What started as apathy had curdled into something actively malicious. The floorboards beneath her bare feet were frigid as she rose. The dull ache in her muscles, already a familiar companion. The list of chores taped to the kitchen door seemed to grow longer each morning, detailing tasks that were not only excessive but nonsensical. Polishing the underside of furniture legs, scrubbing patio stones with only a small brush, reorganizing pantries that had just been cleaned the day before. These were not tasks meant to keep a house tidy. They were punishments designed to exhaust and humiliate. Failure to complete these arbitrary labors, or even a perceived slowness, invited swift and disproportionate retribution. A spilled drop of water could earn hours standing in a corner, hunger gnawing at her empty stomach, while the scent of cooking food drifted mockingly from the kitchen. A tired sigh was met with the withholding of a warm bath, leaving her muscles stiff and sore. The small treats or simple joys that might have brightened a difficult day, a second helping at dinner, a moment to read, even just a kind word, were systematically stripped away. The casual neglect she had endured now felt like a calculated campaign to break her spirit, piece by agonizing piece. The air itself seemed thick with the palpable unfairness of it all, a constant weight pressing down on her chest. She felt the sting of tears welling, not from sadness, but from a simmering, righteous anger at the sheer injustice of it all. There was no longer a facade of care, however thin, only the naked exercise of power through petty tyranny. Each unfair punishment, each back-breaking chore, each comfort denied, chipped away at her sense of safety, replacing it with a cold, hard resolve. They wanted to see her break, but within the core of her being, something was beginning to harden instead. The rough weave of the old blanket scratched against her cheek as she knelt, the scent of dust thick and cloying in the stagnant air of the orphanage's forgotten storeroom. Light filtered thinly through a grimy window pane high above, illuminating motes dancing in the gloom. She was tasked with clearing out boxes piled high, forgotten relics of lives that had passed through these cold halls. Her fingers traced the worn cardboard of a box labeled simply MISC. The word faded like so many hopes here. Inside, nestled amongst tangled ribbons, yellowed paper, and snapped elastic bands, something small and cool pressed against her fingertips. She pulled it out, her breath catching slightly. It was a locket, small and tarnished, shaped like a tiny, closed book. The metal felt heavy and cold, intricately engraved with swirling, almost invisible patterns that seemed to whisper forgotten stories. There was a delicate chain attached, thin and fragile, coiled like a sleeping snake. A sense of profound curiosity, sharp and sudden, pierced through the dull ache of her everyday existence. This wasn't just junk. It felt different, special. With trembling fingers, she fumbled with the tiny clasp. It sprang open with a faint click, revealing not a polished mirror or empty space, but a faded, sepia-toned photograph, so tiny it was almost indistinct. She squinted, trying to make out the faces. A man and a woman, perhaps, their features blurred by time and damage. A surge of inexplicable connection warmed her chest, a fragile bud pushing through hardened earth. Could this be connected to her? A sliver of a question she had carried unspoken for years, suddenly solidified into a tangible object in her hand. She carefully closed the locket, clutching it tight, its edges pressing into her palm. Eager, a flicker of hope dancing in her eyes, she sought out Matron Agnes, the woman who oversaw the daily drudgery. Matron Agnes, her face set in its usual lines of weary impatience, barely glanced at the outstretched hand and the small object resting upon it. The warmth from the locket seemed to vanish under her indifferent gaze.
What's that? Found more junk, have we? You were told to clear it out, not play with it.
She didn't even take it, just waved a dismissive hand.
Probably belonged to someone long gone. Worthless old sentimental rubbish. Put it back where you found it, or, better yet, throw it away. It's just clutter.
The matron turned back to her ledger, the harsh finality of her words echoing in the quiet hall. Worthless, just junk. The light in the girl's eyes dimmed, replaced by the familiar shadow of disappointment. The fragile bud of hope retreated, threatened by the cold wind of dismissal. But as she stood there, the locket still warm from her hand, its weight a solid presence, she didn't drop it. She closed her fingers around it, tucking it carefully into the pocket of her thin dress. It might be worthless to them, but to her, it was a mystery, a secret spark in the overwhelming darkness, a fragment of a past she suddenly, desperately needed to understand. The smooth, cool surface of the object felt alien beneath Elara's fingertips, a stark contrast to the rough-hewn wood and worn fabrics that made up her world. It pulsed with a faint internal light, barely visible unless she held it just so in the dim light of her corner of the dwelling. Days blurred into a quiet obsession, while others bustled with their tasks, their laughter or grumbling echoing through the common spaces. Elara retreated inward, her gaze fixed on the intricate patterns woven into the object's surface. She turned it over and over, tracing the lines, trying to decipher their meaning. It felt like a key, but to what locked door? A quiet hum seemed to emanate from it sometimes, a frequency only she perceived, resonating deep within her chest. It wasn't just an object, it was a question, a persistent whisper demanding answers about a past that felt both distant and strangely familiar. The air around it seemed thinner, charged with an energy that made the fine hairs on her arms stand on end. She inhaled deeply, catching a faint scent of ozone and something like rain-washed stone, utterly foreign in this place. Driven by an insistent curiosity, she decided to breach the wall of silence that surrounded anything connected to the outside or the before times. Approaching one of the elders, a woman whose face was etched with years of hardship and a deep-seated weariness, Elara held the object partially concealed in her palm.
Excuse me, Elder Maya. I found this. Do you know anything about objects like it? From before?
Her voice was hesitant, barely a murmur above the ambient noise of the room, yet it felt deafeningly loud to her. Maya's eyes, usually soft despite the lines around them, hardened instantly. She didn't even look at the object. A wave of palpable annoyance washed over her features, erasing any trace of warmth.
Put that thing away. We don't speak of such things. It's forbidden.
The elder's tone was sharp, dismissive, leaving no room for further inquiry. She turned her back, resuming her task as if Elara had never spoken, her shoulders stiff with disapproval. Later, she tried another approach, asking one of the younger men, Goran, about old stories or legends about strange items. He was usually more open, but the moment she steered the conversation towards the forbidden past, his demeanor shifted. He avoided her gaze, his fingers fumbling nervously with a piece of twine.
Goran, have you ever heard tales about things that look different? Made of materials we don't have here?
He mumbled a reply, his voice low and strained.
There are no such tales worth hearing, Elara. Leave the past buried where it belongs. It only brings trouble.
He quickly invented an urgent task elsewhere, practically fleeing her presence. Each attempt was met with the same wall of resistance. Averted eyes, terse responses, palpable fear or annoyance. The coldness in their reactions chilled Elara more than any draft. It wasn't just ignorance. It was an active, deliberate suppression. They didn't just not know. They refused to know, refused to let her know. The weight of their collective silence pressed down on her. Heavy and suffocating, the object in her hand, once a beacon of curiosity, now felt like a burden, a symbol of the truth they desperately wanted to keep hidden, reinforcing the daunting isolation of her quest. The cold, dead air of the lower archives settled heavy on her shoulders like a shroud. It smelled of decay, of forgotten paper turning brittle with time, a fitting scent for the graveyard of forgotten truths. Dust lay thick on every surface, blurring the edges of filing cabinets stacked high like silent sentinels. She had been assigned this task, retrieving obsolete records from the deepest, most neglected corner of the building. A clear message that her own claims, her own fight, were considered equally obsolete. Despair had become a constant companion in these halls, its weight a physical ache in her chest, crushing the very breath from her lungs. Each step echoed in the silence, a lonely sound in a place designed for silence. But as she turned a corner, navigating a narrow passage between towering metal shelves, a faint murmur reached her ears. It was the sound of voices, hushed but clear, filtering through a slightly ajar door just ahead. Curiosity, a feeling she thought had been extinguished long ago, pricked at her. She paused, leaning back against a cold metal cabinet, the chill seeping through her thin clothes. The voices grew clearer, familiar in the worst possible way. It was Henderson and Davies, two figures whose dismissive attitudes had been central to her suffering, the architects of the official narrative that had buried her truth. They spoke casually, carelessly, clearly assuming this desolate wing was empty.
Still can't believe that report went missing. If she ever found it.
A sharp, derisive laugh followed.
Please, it's gone. Besides, who'd ever look down here? She's buried under enough paperwork to sink a ship. The official version is airtight.
True. Just a minor loose end. Nothing to worry about. Pass me that box.
The sound of shuffling paper followed, then footsteps moving away from the door. Elara stood frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. A missing report connected to it, the official version. Airtight? The blood drained from her face, then surged back with a fiery intensity. They had lied, not just omitted, but fabricated a version of events, making sure crucial evidence was gone. The very report that could corroborate her story, that could prove the object's true nature and importance, was deliberately hidden. The despair that had clung to her for so long began to fracture, tiny cracks appearing in its suffocating shell. A different feeling, sharp and unfamiliar, began to push through, a spark, a tiny, fierce ember of hope ignited in the ashes of her defeat. They thought it was gone. They thought she was buried. But they had just revealed a path, however faint, through the darkness. The forgotten archives suddenly felt less like a tomb and more like a potential battlefield. The stale air tasted of opportunity. The weight of the folded paper felt heavy in Elara's pocket, a constant, nagging pressure against her thigh. It was more than just a piece of paper. It was a whispered secret, a breadcrumb left in the dark forest of her torment. For too long, she had merely endured, buffeted by forces she couldn't understand or combat. But this was a chance to fight back. not with shouts and accusations that would surely be dismissed, but with quiet, irrefutable truth. The shift was subtle, an internal steeling of resolve. She was no longer just the target. She was the hunter, moving silently. Her first steps were taken under the veil of anonymity the public library offered. The air in the genealogy section was thick with the smell of aged paper, and dust motes danced in the weak light filtering through tall windows. Shelves upon shelves loomed like silent sentinels, guarding forgotten stories. Her fingers, trembling slightly, traced titles and brittle, yellowed spines. Town histories, old business directories, archived newspapers. Every rustle of paper felt unnaturally loud. Every creak of the old wooden floorboards seemed to echo her presence. She felt a knot of tension tightening in her stomach, a constant fear of being seen, of her quiet quest being exposed before it had even truly begun. Hours blurred into a monotonous cycle of scanning small print, the words sometimes swimming before her eyes. The clue was specific, but translating it into tangible information buried under decades of records felt like searching for a single grain of sand on a vast beach. Frustration gnawed at her resolve. A familiar companion from her past struggles, yet the memory of the injustice she had suffered fueled a stubborn fire within her. She pushed past the weariness, past the ache in her neck, past the gnawing doubt that whispered this was a futile effort. Then, a small detail in a faded newspaper clipping caught her eye. A name, a date, a connection that resonated with the information the clue had provided. It was just a fragment, a tiny piece in a much larger, unsettling puzzle, but it sparked a fierce, protective warmth in her chest. It confirmed that the clue was real, that the path she was tentatively walking was not a dead end. It was the smallest flicker of light in the oppressive darkness, but it was enough to strengthen her grip on the brittle paper, enough to send a surge of cold determination through her veins. The quiet investigation had yielded its first fragile fruit, promising that more uncomfortable truths lay hidden, waiting to be unearthed by careful, relentless searching. The hunt was truly underway. The old floorboards creaked a mournful tune under Elara's careful tread. The air in the hidden nook smelled of dust and forgotten things, a scent that clung to her skin and hair like a shroud. For weeks, she had pored over the scraps of information she had painstakingly gathered, piecing together fragments of a past denied to her. It was a name, scribbled on the back of a faded photograph found tucked inside a loose floorboard, that finally offered a thread connecting the suffocating world of the orphanage to the vast unknown outside. Thomas Ashton, a name that echoed faintly in the few scattered documents mentioning her parents. But contacting him was a challenge that felt insurmountable from within these walls. Every glance was watched, every movement tracked. Yet, the hunger for truth gnawed at her, a relentless ache in her chest. She had to try. With a desperate hope clutching at her heart, she found a way. A secret note passed through the hesitant hands of a kind, if naive, kitchen worker who saw only a simple request for a forgotten item, not a lifeline cast into the darkness. The wait that followed was agony. Each sunrise brought a fresh wave of despair. Each sunset deepened the fear that her fragile hope had been crushed, or worse, discovered. Her stomach tightened with anxiety whenever she saw the matron's sharp eyes scanning the hallways, imagining discovery at any moment. Then, one damp Tuesday afternoon, the kitchen worker beckoned her aside, her face a mixture of nervousness and urgency. Hidden within a small brown paper package, supposedly containing extra mending supplies, was a folded note, not addressed to Elara by name, but containing a cryptic reference only she would understand, a specific flower her mother had loved. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the brittle paper, the rough texture a stark contrast to the smooth, cold reality of her life. The ink seemed to leap from the page. It was brief, cautious, but undeniably a response. The words swam before her eyes at first, then sharpened into terrifying focus. The note confirmed the name Elara had sent, acknowledging a connection to her parents. More than that, it hinted at a truth far darker and more complex than she had ever imagined, a truth that contradicted everything she had been told about their disappearance. It mentioned circumstances, protection, and a world outside the orphanage walls that was aware, watchful. The air grew thin in her lungs. She felt lightheaded, anchored only by the fierce pounding of her heart. It wasn't just confirmation. It was validation that the orphanage had lied. There was a world out there that remembered, that knew, a voice. Hesitant at first, then strengthening, as he spoke of cautious steps and hidden dangers. A voice that promised to reveal what had been so carefully concealed for so long.
I know who you are, and I know the truth they kept from you. This is only the beginning.
His message ended there, a cliffhanger delivered across the invisible chasm separating her from the world. A single line, yet it detonated the carefully constructed facade of her past, leaving behind the rubble of lies and the sharp, dangerous edges of a dawning reality. She clutched the note, the thin paper a sudden source of immense strength, a tangible link to a possible future she had only dared to dream of. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but now it was edged with a fierce, burning resolve. She was not alone, and the truth, however terrifying, was within reach. The air in the meeting room hung heavy, thick with unspoken accusations and the sterile scent of polished wood in apprehension. Elara stood straighter than she had in years, her fingers tracing the edges of the worn satchel clutched in her hand, its rough leather a familiar comfort. Inside lay the culmination of her relentless search, pieces of truth meticulously gathered, evidence that felt both fragile and impossibly heavy. She had orchestrated this moment, called disassembly, under the pretense of a necessary discussion, but her true purpose pulsed beneath the surface, a secret current of determination. Murmurs rippled through the assembled faces, some curious, some dismissive, some overtly hostile. She felt the prickling gaze of those who had benefited from the lie, their eyes narrowed with suspicion, sensing the precarious balance of their world beginning to tilt. The sound of a clearing throat drew attention. The esteemed figure who had agreed to lend his presence, a man of quiet authority, nodded almost imperceptibly towards Elara. He represented the external help, a beacon of impartiality she desperately needed to illuminate the shadows. A faint tremor ran through her hand, not of fear, but of the immense gravity of the coming revelation. Every sacrifice, every whispered doubt, every lonely night spent poring over dusty records had led her here. The tension was a palpable thing, a wire stretched taut across the room, ready to snap. She could taste the metallic tang of adrenaline on her tongue. It felt like standing on the edge of a precipice, knowing that the next step would either lead to vindication or utter ruin. Those who had tried to keep her silenced shifted in their seats, their initial complacency replaced by a growing unease. One of them, a woman whose smile never reached her cold eyes, leaned forward.
Must we endure this charade, Elara? We have important matters.
The words, sharp and laced with disdain, were meant to dismiss her, to shrink her back into the corner she had occupied for so long. But they only solidified Elara's resolve. Another voice, lower and more menacing, added its weight.
Perhaps you've had too much time on your hands, digging up old ghost stories.
The condescending tone grated, a familiar sound of the dismissiveness she had faced for years. But this time, it lacked conviction. The truth, she knew, had a way of casting long shadows, and their fear was beginning to show. Elara felt a surge of quiet power. The situation was set. The players were gathered. The truth was undeniable, waiting only for her to lift the veil. The world held its breath, poised on the brink of change. The air in the common room had been thick with its usual low hum of muted conversations, the clatter of supper dishes, and the underlying tension that always seemed to cling to the peeling paint of the orphanage walls. Then, the door swung open, admitting two figures, a tall, imposing man in a sharp suit, and a woman holding a worn leather document case. Their presence immediately drew eyes, but no one could have anticipated the seismic shift about to occur. The man stepped forward, his voice calm, but carrying an undeniable weight that cut through the room's meager noise. He introduced himself and his companion, then explained why they were there. He wasn't there to donate toys or volunteer time. He was there on a matter of family. A long-lost search finally concluded. Every eye was on him. Then they followed his gaze as he turned slightly, his hand gesturing towards Elara, who sat quietly at a table near the back, smaller than the others, trying as usual to blend into the shadows.
After years of searching, after countless dead ends and heartbreaking false hopes, we have found her. This young woman, Elara. She is the daughter of the Sterling family, the lost heiress to Sterling Enterprises.
The name hung in the air, Sterling. It wasn't just a name, it was a dynasty, synonymous with immense wealth, power, and influence that reached far beyond the orphanage's grimy gates. A fork clattered onto a plate somewhere. A younger child, holding a half-eaten biscuit, simply froze, the treat halfway to their mouth. The low hum died instantly, replaced by a profound, echoing silence that pressed in on every ear. The orphanage director, a woman whose face usually held a permanent expression of weary indifference or sharp disapproval, felt the blood drain from her face. Her eyes, usually narrowed in judgment towards Elara, bulged with sheer, unadulterated disbelief. The other staff members shared similar expressions of stunned paralysis, their mouths agape, hands halfway through tasks suddenly abandoned. The very air seemed to grow cold, filled with the tangible chill of shock. Among the children, especially those who had taken cruel pleasure in Elara's misery, a collective gasp rippled through the room. Faces that had twisted into sneers of derision now paled, eyes wide with dawning, horrifying realization. Sarah, the ringleader, felt a knot of ice form in her stomach. The words "lost heiress," "Sterling family," reverberated in her skull, mocking every shove, every harsh word, every stolen meal. Thomas, who had always seen Elara as easy prey, stumbled back a step, knocking into a chair with a loud scrape that felt deafening in the silence. Elara herself remained still for a long moment, absorbing the pronouncement that changed everything. A quiet strength settled over her features, replacing the usual weariness. She looked around the room, her gaze sweeping over the faces, the shocked staff, the terrified bullies, the bewildered younger children. There was no triumph in her eyes yet, only a deep, quiet knowing. The truth was out, shattering the world everyone in this room had known, and leaving only the stunned, suffocating silence in its wake. The smell of stale food and disinfectant seemed to intensify, strangely counterpoint to the clean, expensive scent emanating from the visitors. It felt like standing at the edge of a precipice, the old life crumbling behind them, the new one stretching out into an unbelievable distance. A hush fell over the opulent room, thicker and heavier than the silk tapestries adorning the walls. The air, moments before filled with whispers and condescending laughter, now felt thin and cold. Eyes, previously dismissive or filled with malice, were now wide with a mixture of dawning horror and frantic calculation. She stood amidst the sudden silence, no longer the invisible servant, but the undeniable focal point. The grand doors swung open again, admitting not just people, but an aura of immense, quiet power. Two figures entered, their movements precise and unhurried. Their attire was impeccable, speaking of old money and unquestionable authority. Their gazes swept the room, cool and assessing, before settling upon her. These were the representatives, dispatched the moment her true lineage was confirmed, her family's direct assertion of her place in the world. The contrast was jarring. Only moments ago, she had been indistinguishable from the other staff, her simple dress a deliberate choice to remain unseen. Now, bathed in the reflected light of the crystal chandeliers, the inherent nobility she possessed, long suppressed, seemed to radiate from her. The air around her shimmered with a power that was not her own doing, but her birthright, suddenly made manifest. The subtle scent of expensive leather and a faint, authoritative perfume drifted from the newcomers, a tangible symbol of the world she now undeniably belonged to. Those who had mocked her, stepped over her, or treated her with utter contempt felt a knot tighten in their stomachs. The forced smiles that appeared on their faces were brittle, like thin ice cracking under sudden weight. They shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between her and the formidable figures who stood at her side, guardians of her new reality. A woman who had cruelly dismissed her requests yesterday edged forward, her previous sneer replaced by a sickly, sweet grin.
Oh, my dear, we had no idea. Such wonderful news. You must allow us to offer our sincerest congratulations.
Her voice, usually sharp and cutting, was now syrupy and trembling slightly at the edges. A man who had publicly ridiculed her simple attire cleared his throat, extending a tentative hand, sweat beading on his forehead.
Truly astonishing. A remarkable turn of events. We are all so delighted for you.
His usual booming confidence had evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, desperate tone. She met their gazes, her expression calm, almost detached. The fear in their eyes was palpable, a bitter aroma filling the space between them. They saw not just her, but the vast, untouchable power that now stood behind her. Karma was not a distant concept. It was a cold, immediate wave washing over them, drowning them in their own regret and the chilling certainty of consequences. The forced pleasantries felt like ashes on their tongues, a prelude to the reckoning they knew was inevitable. The worn linoleum of the orphanage director's office felt strangely solid beneath Elara's feet, a stark contrast to the trembling uncertainty she had once known within these walls. A quiet strength now settled within her, a resolve born from enduring the unthinkable and emerging into a new dawn. Director Hayes sat stiffly behind her desk, her face a mask of forced composure that couldn't hide the flicker of fear in her eyes. Beside her perched Mrs. Gable, the head caretaker, whose cold indifference had been a constant source of misery, her usual smirk replaced by a thin, tight line. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of stale air freshener and unspoken accusations. Elara didn't raise her voice, her tone level, devoid of the raw emotion they might have expected. She simply stated the facts, the documented incidents, the patterns of neglect and cruelty. Each word was a stone placed upon a scale, slowly but surely tipping the balance against them. She watched their reactions. Director Hayes fidgeted, her eyes darting to the closed door, while Mrs. Gable's fingers drummed silently on the armrest of her chair, a nervous tick. Suddenly, the door opened and Mr. Sterling, a senior board member known for his stern fairness, stepped inside. The tension in the room ratcheted higher. His gaze swept over the three women before settling on Elara, a look of quiet respect in his eyes. Then he turned to the two women who had held power here for so long. His voice, usually warm, was now clipped, carrying the cold weight of finality.
Director Hayes, Mrs. Gable, we have reviewed the extensive reports filed, corroborated by multiple sources and internal audits. The evidence is damning.
Director Hayes visibly paled, her carefully constructed composure crumbling. Mrs. Gable's face contorted in a brief flash of defiance before fear took hold.
Reports? What reports? This is ridiculous. Someone's trying to make trouble?
Mrs. Gable's voice was shrill, desperate, a stark contrast to her usual measured cruelty. Mr. Sterling's expression remained unchanged, his eyes like chips of ice.
The board has voted unanimously. Effective immediately, you are both placed on administrative leave, pending a full investigation by external authorities. Your access to the premises is revoked.
Elara felt a shiver, not of fear, but of profound, quiet satisfaction. This wasn't about vengeance in the traditional sense, but about justice finally stirring. The power they had wielded, the casual disregard they had shown for vulnerable lives, was now unraveling. The cold, decisive tone in Mr. Sterling's voice echoed the certainty of their impending downfall. The smell of fear now truly permeated the room, thick and unpleasant. Elara simply watched, her presence a quiet, powerful testament to the truth they could no longer suppress. The consequences had begun. The scent of blooming jasmine drifted through the open window, a sweetness Elara had once believed was reserved only for dreams. Sunlight, warm and generous, spilled across the polished wooden floorboards of a home that finally felt like hers. She sat by the window, a cup of herbal tea warming her hands, and watched two children laughing as they chased a brightly colored ball in the garden outside, her chosen family. This life, vibrant and full of light, was a universe away from the dim, neglected corners she had inhabited for so long. She thought of the cold indifference that had been her constant companion, the subtle chill that permeated her very existence before. The journey from that shadow world to this place of belonging had been arduous, a climb etched with moments of despair and quiet triumph. The lessons were imprinted on her soul. Resilience wasn't just about enduring hardship, it was about finding the strength to redefine your own worth when others sought to diminish it. It was about recognizing that the absence of expected love didn't mean love itself was absent from the world, just that you needed to seek it elsewhere. Her choices regarding those who had wronged her had been difficult. Forgiveness, she realized, was not always about absolving the offender, but about releasing herself from the corrosive grip of bitterness. Justice, in its truest form, had arrived, not through vengeance, but through the natural consequences their own actions brought upon them, freeing her to build anew. Here, in the gentle rhythm of this life, she understood the true meaning of family wasn't defined by bloodlines etched in cold records, but by the bonds forged in shared moments, mutual respect, and unwavering kindness. The laughter outside, the comforting weight of the teacup, the feeling of solid ground beneath her feet. These were the simple, profound anchors of a life built, not on the ruins of the past, but on the foundation of lessons learned and a future claimed. And so, she lived, breathing in the sweet air of freedom and peace. The scars remained, faint etchings on the timeline of her spirit, but they were no longer open wounds. They were reminders of the depth of the shadows she had escaped and the incredible distance she had traveled towards the light. The warmth of the sun on her skin was more than just physical sensation. It was a tangible manifestation of the warmth that had finally found its way into her heart. The quiet hum of the household around her was a melody of acceptance, a symphony of a life finally lived in harmony. She had not just survived, she had thrived, proving that even from the deepest neglect, a life of purpose and profound belonging could blossom, a testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit to seek, find, and cherish its rightful place in the world. The echoes of the past grew softer each day, replaced by the vibrant sounds of a present filled with love and the promise of serene tomorrows.